Good. This is the fourth of a four-part series on women in American history, and today is Amelia Earhart. Next week we start an equally uplifting series, but on the Russian Revolution. That'll be 4 weeks as well. And that will start same time on Monday, this coming Monday. And that will start. And to start that, we'll start with the basics, Marx and the Communist Manifesto. And that'll be a lead-in to the Russian Revolution. And for those of you who can't get enough of this stuff, I'm going to be over at the New Canaan Library tonight. And they're going to want me to oversee a discussion on that recent series that Ken Burns and Lynn Novak did on Vietnam. So that'll be at the New Canaan Library tonight at 6:30. That was a pretty good series, by the way. Focusing a large part from people who were on the ground, so to speak, like soldiers, Marines, and VC and North Vietnamese, and then people back here in the streets, so on and so forth. So it was done pretty good, but that doesn't mean that there isn't room for discussion on what's going on around that. Anyway, Amelia Earhart. Again, this is another one of those ladies, as I mentioned with the other three, who are taking the stature of women and raising it. You know, this is a new era now, the modern times, post-American and French revolutions, all these ideas of effervescing here, and society is changing, and women are changing with it, and they're making their mark. And this is going to be one of them, Amelia Earhart, in something that was considered by many at the time a male-dominated endeavor. And that's not quite true. There were a number of female aviators, Jacqueline Cochran, Anita Snook, who will give flying lessons later to Amelia Earhart. This was a young lady, it's interesting, this was a young lady who, as a child and getting into her teens, used to keep a scrapbook of women making a name for themselves in what was considered male-dominated endeavors. Photography, sports, manufacturing, invention, so on and so forth. She kept a scrapbook of this. Interesting. But she's actually born in Atchison, Kansas on July 24, 1897. Her father is Samuel Edwin Stanton Earhart, and her mother is Amelia Amy Otis Earhart. She will have one sister, Grace Muriel Earhart. She's born 2 years later, 1899. And just as a side note here, she didn't like to be called Grace. She liked the name Muriel. The little trivia there. But she will live till 1998. She lived a long time. Both girls were adventurous. At the time, and they're living in their maternal grandmother's home in Atchison, Kansas, and her grandfather at one point had been a judge, and was actually a banking executive. So the family had a few bucks here. But the fact of the matter is, they were both adventurous, even to the point where their mother would make sure they didn't wear, the longer dresses women used to wear in the 19th century. They were wearing bloomers. The grandmother thought, well, that's not all that great. That's against convention here. And Amelia, or Amy Otis Earhart, pushed the girls to be adventurous. Even to the point where, as a youngster, Amelia Earhart was shooting rats with a rifle. But they were also hiking, collecting animals, moths, katydids, toads, birds, whatever the case may be. In fact, they're going to visit an uncle. And when Amelia is like 7, 8 years old, her uncle was rather out there too. He had a tool shed. And on the end of this tool shed, he built a ramp. And so Amelia is going down the tool shed roof in a box and then off the ramp. Come crashing down, and she says to her sister, gee, this is like flying. There's another aspect of this too. The nicknames between the girls. Amelia was called at one point Millie, And Muriel was actually called Pidge. Pidge. But of the two, Amelia was a bit more the daredevil or a tomboy, if you want to use that term, at the time. And her father works for the Rock Island Railroad. He's actually a claims officer. And as we get into this, the fortunes of the family will change for a period of time because he develops tipping the arm here. And that's not going to help the family. He's going to be transferred to Des Moines, Iowa, when Amelia Earhart is 10, which means 1907. And at this point, the girls and Mrs. Earhart are still living at the grandmother's house, but eventually they're going to move. And in 1907, when she's 10 years old, she actually sees her first plane at the Des Moines at a Des Moines State Fair, Iowa State Fair. And her father asks her, "Do you want to go up?" And she says, "No, I don't want to do that. I don't want to do that." Keep in mind, Mr. Earhart's drinking is becoming a bit more pronounced. And so Amy Otis Earhart's mother, they do have a few dollars, as I said. She has a trust. And she puts the trust solely in her daughter's name and leaves the husband off because she's afraid he will drink the trust. And so this is going to foster a further split here as the drinking ensues. Up till this point, we'll get to like 12 years old. Amelia and her sister are homeschooled. They've never gone to public school. Mrs. Earhart, or a governess, school the children. Amelia develops a passion or a penchant for reading. She's a voracious reader, which I guess accounts for her intelligence, at least in some respect. Her father is eventually going to lose his job, but wind up in St. Paul, Minnesota, working for the Great Northern Railroad, the same sort of job. However, he's going to have another issue here. He's drinking, but at the same time, he gets this new job as a claims officer with another railroad in St. Paul, Minnesota. But the person he replaced, now he wants his job back. And so he will lose this job. And at this point, Amy is going to take the two children. The drinking is getting to the point where it's really not becoming a very good family situation. And on top of that, Grandma's going to die. And so, despite the fact she has some money coming to her, Amy, they're going to have to auction off the grandmother's house. And that they're going to do. And Amelia Earhart will later say, "That was the end of my childhood." She had many happy times in her grandmother's house. But by the time she's in 1914, 1915, they're in Chicago. They're living with friends while the separation between Mr. and Mrs. Earhart ensues here. And so both Amy and her daughter Amelia are looking for a high school for Amelia to finish out her high school term in a high school that has a good science program. And they go to a high school not far from the house, and the two decline it because Amelia later says, "My mother thought the science lab was a little better than a sink." I mean, this lady's into science, and she's very well. She has a very well approach to life here, a widespread approach to life, and so they wind up in Hyde Park High School. If anyone lived in Chicago or has been to high school knows where that is. And she's very much a solitary person too. In fact, in her yearbook, it will say reference that this young lady in brown is very much the loner. That's in her yearbook. At this point, with the separation between her mother and father, by 1916, going into 1917, she travels to Toronto. Her sister had been up in Toronto for a little while now, by 1917. And it's here that Amelia Earhart sees the wounded coming back from the Western Front in Canada. And she's taken by, this is modern, industrialized, commercialized war. Not pretty, no war is, but this war in particular, because of industry. And so she volunteers as a nurse's aide for the Red Cross at Spadina Military Hospital. And this is what she's going to be doing now for almost a year. However, like a lot of other people at this time, I'm talking just the end of the war, the Spanish flu hits. But she doesn't really get the flu. She gets pneumonia and maxillary sinusitis. In other words, she has a severe sinus infection. She's laid up from the end of October, November through December. She has such intense pressure on her head because of the sinus infection. It needs to be drained. And it's not by blowing your nose here, folks. She needs a tube to drain. And she has severe pressure on one eye, which means obviously she can't read too well here, which really must turn her off. And so she's going to need at least a year to recuperate here. A year. She has a number of operations which do not correct the problem. So she's going to join her sister in Northampton, Massachusetts, where her sister is living now. We're talking 1919 going into 1920. And so she's recuperating. Again, she's back to doing a lot of reading on many things. Science, mechanics, a wide variety. Even to the point, poetry. This girl is fairly well read. She has intentions of going to Smith College. Then changes her mind and wants to go to Columbia, study medicine. However, in 1920, she drops going to Columbia because her mother and father are getting together. So she will leave Massachusetts and go to California in 1920. Long Beach, to be exact here. She gets to California, and on December 28, 1920, her and her father go to a fair. There's a man called Frank Hawkins. Frank Hawkins is a stunt flyer. He will later be known around this country as an air racer. Father asks, now do you want to go up in the airplane? It's $10 for a ride. She goes up. She gets to 300 or 400 feet, and now I know what I want to do for the rest of my life. Fly. And when she comes down, the question is, where do I get the money from? Going from 1920 to 1921. She will work a number of jobs to raise money. She becomes a stenographer for a phone company, a photographer. She was into photography, by the way, and even driving a truck in January of 1921. She will get, her mother and father will help a little bit, but she'll accumulate $1,000 for the flight lessons. She will entertain the idea of approaching Anita Snook, which she does, who's also known as Nita. And she teaches people to fly. So, will you teach me to fly? Anita says yes. And you know how determined this lady was? She would take a bus to get to the airfield, take a bus to the end of the line, and then walk another 3-4 miles to the airfield. She learns to fly. This is a determined young lady at this point. She learns to fly. She will buy a plane. A Kinner Airplane Company, the Airster, which it's a double-wing plane and it's yellow. She names it the Canary. And so on October 22, 1922, she will take this open cockpit, double-wing, yellow plane and reach 14,000 feet and set the female altitude record for female flyers. Now her name is getting to be on the map here. And in May of 1923, she will be the 16th lady, the 16th female to get an air flying license from the Fédération Aéronautique Internationale, or the FAI. She's moving along here. However, keep in mind here, in 1924, Mom and Dad can't keep it together. The split. The money, the trust, is just about depleted at this point. So Amelia Earhart has to sell her beloved Canary, and she had gotten another plane. They have to sell that one too. Her and her mother will buy a car. They're going to travel cross country from California to Massachusetts with a brief stop at Banff, Alberta. But they travel completely across country to Massachusetts. Keep in mind, periodically she's still afflicted with these bouts from her sinus. In fact, even later on, there were episodes where she would wear a bandage over the drain. I haven't seen too many photos of that, but she was still afflicted with this. However, when she gets to Massachusetts, she will have an operation, and this, up to this point, has been the most successful operation in trying to alleviate her of this affliction. Keep in mind, she wants to go back to Columbia, 1924, 1925. She tries to get in, but the money's not there. She winds up being a teacher, a social worker, but she keeps her hand in flying. She begins to write. Well, she's a pretty voracious reader. She's writing. And she's writing in local periodicals, newspapers, maybe some magazines, about flying, and also women involved in flying. And so she's keeping her name in the game here. She begins to fly out of a place called Denison, Massachusetts, which will later be an airport. However, at the same time, as she's beginning to make her name here, in 1927, doesn't Charles Lindbergh cross the Atlantic? Yeah, first one to do so, right? There were numerous people that tried and didn't make it. He does. And so does this fire interest in crossing the Atlantic? Yes. I mean, keep in mind, there are many of our fellow people here, many of our fellow species who want to see what's on the other side of the hill here. And Lindbergh, I guess, was one of them. Lucky Lindy? It's an interesting story about him when Roosevelt, God bless you, Roosevelt sent him to Nazi Germany. At one point, he was going to send General Jean Vidal to assess, this is later on in the 30s, to assess the advancement of the Luftwaffe. Then he decided against it because he thought if he sent a member of the U.S. government, well, if you're in the military, you're a member of the U.S. government, that it might be, we might be indicating that we're pro-Nazi Germany, so he sent Lindbergh instead. Lindbergh was very much the proponent of the B-17 Flying Fortress. Well, anybody who did anyone accomplished what he did is because he's looking to what? Long distance flying. Do you know they sent him to the South Pacific in 1943 to train P-38 Lightning pilots out of New Guinea? And he was actually flying on some of the missions. He's not really supposed to do this. And when he was attached to the 5th Fighter Squadron, in one of his first missions, he was flying a P-38, which is a big twin boom fighter in World War II. And Lieutenant Colonel Charles McDonald, the commander of the squadron, they all take off, and they're going to, and he's supposed to teach these pilots how to get more miles out of a gallon of fuel. Long-range cruise control. Well, McDonald looks in the rear view of his plane, and he sees that Lindbergh's fallen farther and farther behind. He didn't put up his landing gear. He didn't put up his landing gear. And so McDonald gets on the horn and says, "Hey, Lindy, you better get your gear up. That ain't the Spirit of St. Louis you're flying." But come to find out, Lindbergh got involved in air-to-air combat. He wasn't supposed to. And he's reputedly credited with 4 Japanese planes. He missed one being an ace, but he's a civilian. And McDonald has to save his bacon because at one point a Japanese fighter got on his tail, and McDonald has to shoot it down. And when that news gets upstairs, McDonald will be relieved of command and sent home, and so will Lindbergh. The country, if you imagine if you're in Washington and the Roosevelt administration, and Lindbergh is lost on your watch, and something like that might not go over so good. But Amelia Earhart in 1928, you know, there's going to be another flight across the Atlantic. She gets a phone call. How would you like to fly the Atlantic? But she's not going to pilot the plane. Wilmer Stutz will do that. Leo Gordon will be the co-pilot / mechanic. She will keep the flight log. They will cross the Atlantic and fly to South Wales. And that's where they will land. Well, this is big stuff in 1928. A woman in an airplane crossing the Atlantic. There's a big parade in England. And when the 3 airmen come back to this country, there will be a big ticker tape parade in New York. And she's asked, gee, this must be a great achievement here. She says, I was just baggage. She didn't fly the plane. She said, I was baggage. And so, because she kept the flight log. That's what she did. Well, somebody had to do it, but she's a woman, so she's going to keep the flight log. And she said, but maybe, just maybe, I will do it by myself. And that's exactly what's going to happen here. But that's a few years down the road. But she's very much in demand. Now, guess who's anyone want to take a guess on who is one of those pushing the publicity here? George Palmer Putnam, the great publisher. He's very much into this. And keep in mind, Amelia Earhart at one point was engaged to be married. She broke it off. But George Palmer Putnam was married to a Dorothy Binney, and they have 2 children. George Putnam Palmer Jr., and then David Putnam. And they're going to get a divorce. And so George Palmer Putnam will eventually ask Amelia to marry him 6 times. She will finally acquiesce. But in the meantime, as this is going on here, now she's very much in the news. There's even going to be an Amelia Earhart, or AE, clothing line. And it accentuates her because if you look at her, she's a slender woman. In fact, some people used to say, Lucky Lindy, Lady Lindy. Interesting how that is. But she's very much her.
Did they know each other, Lindbergh and?
Oh yeah, oh yeah. In fact, in just 2 minutes, you'll see how much they know each other, because they're both into civilian flying, or civilian aspects of air travel, which they think is a big thing to push this thing known as aviation. I mean, keep in mind, aviation is new technology. Everybody is enamored with new technology, for the most part. So air travel is, as is air power. And so, luggage line, AE luggage line. And another thing, Lucky Strike cigarettes. Who remembers what I said here last week about Edward Bernays, the father of American public relations or propaganda? He was the one that helped sell the fiction that World War I was fought for democracy. He was Sigmund Freud's nephew. I've been giving talks on this guy. He's getting popular here because hardly anyone ever heard of him. And he will, after the war, sell cigarettes. Lucky Strikes were one of them. In fact, he focuses on women for his public relations efforts. Well, women got the right to vote, 1920, right? So let's stick with that one, that'll work. And he comes up with a propaganda picture, interesting, maybe you've seen it. It was in many leading magazines, of a slender, good-looking woman in a slinky red dress with a cigarette between 2 fingers and a faraway look like out a window. And the caption is, Torches of Freedom. Smoke cigarettes, torches of freedom. In fact, when he was working for L&M, he got a lot of female opera singers who were telling people, cigarette smoking is good for your throat. We're opera singers, aren't we? Works. And so it wouldn't surprise me that if Mr. Bernays is behind that campaign to have a woman like Amelia Earhart push Lucky Strike cigarettes, but she was in the campaign. Interesting here. George Palmer Putnam, he will ask her to marry him 6 times. She will finally acquiesce and marry George Palmer Putnam. However, being her own person, she tells George Palmer, the day they're married, She gives him a note the day they're married. I do not expect me to adhere to medieval conventions on marriage. And not only that, I expect the same from you. Oh, and by the way, I'm Amelia Earhart, not Amelia Putnam. Well, you know, the press picks up on this, and now it's George Palmer Earhart. You know, I'm sure that went over well. But this gets to be a wretched marriage because he's constantly trying to push her into the... Well, why not? They're making money off her. In steps Gore Vidal here. Now, it's interesting, some of the people she meets along the way here as she really becomes popular. Eleanor Roosevelt come to mind here? Yeah. In fact, there's a story that in 1934, when Amelia Earhart was in the White House for an overnight stay, her and Ellen, I'm sure first ladies just don't do this anymore because they can't with the way things are today. They got all gussied up and snuck out of the White House for a night on the town. Different time. Different time. In fact, George Palmer Putnam, and they're going to get married in George Palmer Putnam's mother's house up in Noank, Connecticut. And what's interesting here is they don't even have time for a honeymoon. Why? Right after the marriage, she's on a 9-day swing across this country with an autogyro. Ever see one of those? It's a rotary wing aircraft, not a helicopter. It's got stubby wings, has a propeller in the front and a propeller at the top, almost like the beanies. Remember those beanies of the... Yeah. And so in fact, she at one time held the altitude record in an autogyro. 18,415 feet. The Marine Corps will try the autogyro from 1927-28 up till 1932-33 in Nicaragua. And they're using the autogyro as a ground support plane, but their recommendation is we don't want to use it. It doesn't have the payload for it. And what's going to replace that 20 years down the road? The helicopter. See how, again, this thing known as technology is evolving here. And she goes on a 9-day swing with this autogyro, sponsored, by the way, Beech Nut Gum. Hey, you got to have somebody pay for this. Beech Nut Gum. They don't have time for a honeymoon. That's all right, they're making money anyway. Cares about a honeymoon. I mean, what do you say when your wife tells you, I'm not going to adhere to any medieval conventions, and I expect the same thing out of you? Charles Lindbergh, yes, she is one of those like Lindbergh who believes in civilian air transportation. She will be involved in the formation here of transcontinental air transport. TAT, it was known back then, which later evolves into TWA. She's involved in an airline known as the Ludington Line, which is a northeast run from New York City to Washington. It's a shuttle run, but she's involved in this. Another person involved in these initiatives, Gore Vidal's father, General Jean Vidal. Interesting. She, her life with her husband was wretched after a while, and yet, according to the story, Gore Vidal got to know her when he was a little boy. He was born in 1925. And she fell in love with his father, General Jean Vidal, who was one of our earlier Army pilots. And General Vidal liked her a lot. Said, I like you, but I don't love you. And Gore Vidal would later say, I wish she was my mother instead of my mother. And he didn't get along with his mother. And he got to talk to her about the round-the-world flight later on. And they were going over a map of the flight, where she was going to go. And he says, well, and she says the jungle area of Africa would be the most dangerous part. And he says, I told her, I said, well, I would think the Pacific is, all that ocean. And she said, well, no, you have all those islands out there. She says, because if you crash land in the jungle, who's going to find you? Had a little bit of a point, but then what's going to happen in the end? It'll be the Pacific. But he really liked her a lot. In fact, Gore Vidal, when the war is over with, in fact, in the 1950s, when he got to be really good friends with Eleanor Roosevelt, he said to her, he goes, is there any truth to that story about your husband sending her to do a reconnaissance of Japanese possessions in the Pacific? And Eleanor Roosevelt says, well, as you might expect, I did my own investigation. And she says, that's just not true. So you can take what you want out of that. But at this point, she's into many things, and she's still setting various records. However, in 1932, she will take off from Newfoundland, and she will cross the Atlantic Ocean on her own. She does it. She does the trip. She lands at a place called Colmar, which is north of Derry in Northern Ireland. And actually, a journalist gave her a copy of a newspaper in Newfoundland to set the date. Yeah, take a paper, the date she leaves. And when she lands, there's two farmers. They come running up. Where did you come from? She goes, America? And supposedly there is a monument to that landing in that area. But again, you know, it's the parade and so on and so forth. She comes back, and she gets the gold medal from the National Geographic, given to her by the president at the time, Herbert Hoover. And there are other awards being bestowed here. But she got her name in the books as being the first woman to cross the Atlantic Ocean. Interesting here. Absolutely fascinating. You know, and she's still doing a lot of flying. She wanted, her and other female aviators like Jacqueline Cochran wanted to get into the Bendix Air Race, the prestigious at the time Bendix Air Race. Oh no, women can't be involved in this, is men only. You know, they're still trying to break that barrier. In fact, in 1934, it was still men only. But they asked Amelia Earhart to fly in Mary Pickford, the renowned actress at the time, to start the air races. And Amelia Earhart says, get your own chauffeur, I'm not doing it. Yeah, get your own chauffeur, I'm not doing it. And so at this point, you get to 1935, and in January of 1935, she flies from Hawaii to Oakland. She's the first person to cross the Pacific from the Hawaiian Islands to the American coast on that route. April, she flies from California, from Los Angeles to Mexico City. And then in May, June, she leaves Mexico City, flies to New York City, 1935. She's setting a lot of long-range records here. You know, I mean, she's really becoming somebody of stature here. And she's also going to she's beginning to think about this round-the-world flight. Now, keep in mind some of the people she's going to ask to assist her along the way here. One is a Captain Harry Manning. Harry Manning is interesting. She already knows him. He was the captain of the President Roosevelt, the ship that will bring her, Wilmer Stutz, and Leo Gordon home from Europe after the 1928 flight. He's an experienced, not only maritime navigator, but an air navigator. She will pick another man, Fred Noonan. He will be with her when they disappear. But Fred Noonan was also, besides being an air navigator, a maritime navigator. And he was actually working with Pan Am. He charts most of the Pan Am clipper routes across the Pacific. Huh. And so she picks one more man which she meets. Ever hear of Paul Mantz? M-A-N-T-Z. Paul Mantz will later hook up with a gentleman by the name of Frank Tallman. Frank Tallman and Mantz will put their business together later on. In the meantime, in 1935-36, Mantz and Amelia Earhart will get together with a flying school. It will be run for the most part by Mance, but it's nice to have Amelia Earhart's name on it. And obviously Amelia Earhart puts a few bucks into this, her and Putnam, and obviously they're going to make money out of this, but it's run under the auspices of United Air Services, which is run by Paul Mance. One of Mance's claims to fame is he's a stunt pilot for Hollywood, but he's an experienced flyer. But this other man, Frank Tallman, is another one who was doing flying stunts for Hollywood, but was also a renowned airman in his own right. In fact, the two of them will work on later on. It's a mad, 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 mad world. Remember that with the plane with Mickey Rooney and God,
that was funny.
Yeah. But you ever see the movie with Jimmy Stewart, Sir Richard Attenborough, The Flight of the Phoenix? Jimmy Stewart was flying a plane and it goes down in the Sahara Desert. This movie was made in 1965. George Kennedy. And they finally get out when they cannibalize pieces of the plane and fly it out. Well, Frank Tallman was in that, and he got killed in one of the flying sequences. So if you ever see that movie, it states in the back, in memory of Frank Tallman. Interesting. All these things come together. Interesting. But already she is looking for do this round the world cruise. But she takes on Paul Mance. And so she has a pretty good crop of people involved in this endeavor. She will also at this point wind up at Purdue as a visiting lecturer along those lines for aeronautics and other things that pertain to women, but a lot of the aeronautics. Lockheed will supply the plane. A Lockheed Electra twin engine. This plane will have to be reworked, cockpit space, extra fuel tank, fuel tanks. If you're going to go, the whole flight's supposed to be 29,000 miles. That's what this flight's supposed to be. And so constant practicing, so on and so forth, they are ready to go in March of 1937. This is the first attempt, not the second, this is the first attempt. The first attempt saw them going from California to Hawaii first. They're going west. They're not going east. They're going west. And in March of 1937, they take off. Now keep in mind, it's not just her and Noonan. All four of them are on the plane. All four. She's going to fly that leg from California to Hawaii. Now, Fred Noonan was originally supposed to be the navigator from Hawaii to Howland Island, after which Manning would do the navigation from Howland Island to New Guinea, Australia. And then once in Australia, she would just do everything herself at this point. But they thought the Pacific would be the toughest place for navigation. And they make it to Hawaii. They make it. They're going to do some minor repairs on the plane, but when it comes time to take off to do that next leg from Hawaii to Howland Island, some people who watched the film or were on the field thought a tire blew or one of the landing gear struts let go and the plane did this and skids to a stop. Now it's damaged. They can't go on here. Paul Mance later said it was pilot error. Regardless of what causes this mishap, the plane has to be taken back to California to be repaired. And that's exactly what's going to happen here. The plane is taken back to California, and now they're going to have to raise more money now to continue this journey, but going the opposite way. Now they're going east. This is where the common story is here. They're going east. And in May of 1937, the plane is ready to go, only this time it is just Amelia Earhart and Fred Noonan. It's just the two of them, not the four of them. They will cross country getting to Miami. They will leave Miami on January 1, 1937, head down to the Caribbean, South America, and from Natal, Brazil, they will cross that where the South Atlantic is at one of its narrowest points to the African mainland. Do you know that's the flight, that's the course that the United States Army Air Force will use sending B-17s and B-24s to North Africa. They'll fly them down to Natal, Brazil, and from there those bombers will make that jump going to the North African coast and the West African coast, and from there north up to the North African desert. It's a long flight in one of those planes. But she crosses Africa, she crosses into India, she goes down past the Philippines, she winds up in Australia, and from Australia they wind up in Lae, New Guinea. Now here's where the story gets a little discombobulated here. Number one, the airfield at Lae, New Guinea, which is that jump. Keep in mind, out of 29,000 miles, they've already done 22,000. The flight from Lae, New Guinea to Howland Island, keep in mind, Howland Island, you know the size of the Pacific Ocean? You know how big Howland Island is? 6,500 feet long and 1,600 feet wide. And at its highest point, it's 10 feet above sea level. It's a spit. And waiting there for them is a Coast Guard cutter named the Itasca. A Coast Guardsman by the name of Leo Ballarts is in command of radio direction finding equipment, transmission, so on and so forth. And so they're supposed to take off July 2, 1937, and they're going to take off midnight. However, the problem with the Lae airfield is, this plane is full of fuel. And it's not a hard surfaced airfield, it's turf. So what do you think the plane does as it taxis down the airfield? Yeah, exactly. It's not. This isn't stable. They have now again. This is interesting too because they have a loop antenna underneath the plane. Now some people say, having again eyewitness. This is where people get confused, I guess, in certain instances. Some people said the loop aerial was broken off as the plane is bouncing. They never found a loop aerial. On top of that, keep in mind what else you had back in those days. It's not like today where you just pick up the horn and make a transmission. Do you know back then, you were still, many of these radios back then, even though radio equipment in 1937 is far advanced from 1917. This is man and his technology. In many instances, do you know you had a spool on the bottom of the plane and you cranked out the aerial, which was a wire that went back into the slipstream. They were doing this, folks, in the First World War. Keep in mind in World War I, I find this interesting because I work at Army Aviation magazine. I find this fascinating when in First World War, you had some of these planes. People are trying all different things here. Propellers in the front that pull you, props in the back that push you. Now, if you're going to have an observation plane with a prop in the back, how are you going to have a spool of wire and crank it out to the back? That's not going to work. How is that an observation plane? Sure, you can have somebody in a front tub with a clear view. There's no propeller. But what about the aerial if you're going to make a transmission? And keep in mind, back in those days, there were no such things as transistor radios. So in World War I, if you were trying to fashion an observation plane, you had two men, a pilot and a rear gunner, but he was the observer. You had a radio. You had a choice. You could either have a sender or a receiver. You opted for a sender because you're observing, so you want to send what you're observing to the people on the ground. And keep in mind, these are open cockpit planes. How is a voice transmission going to work there? So what did you do? Morse code. But you cranked out the aerial. And when you were done transmitting and you hoped they got the transmission, you re-cranked the aerial up. That's what they had to do. Now, some people who criticize both her and Noonan say they cut off a lot of the aerial because they didn't want to crank it up and uncrank it and crank it up. That's what some of these experts say. But the fact of the matter is, the radio direction finding equipment she had in her plane didn't quite match up with the radio direction finding equipment that Ballarts was using on the Coast Guard cutter Itasca. Being Coast Guard, they have virtually the same equipment as the United States Navy. And so when they take off at midnight, July 2, 1937, on their way to Howland Island, Ballarts is not getting all the transmissions, despite the fact his set might be stronger than hers, but she's transmitting anyway. Some of this Ballard's got. Some he does not get. In fact, one of the commanding admiral who was on the battleship Colorado later on said that atmospherics and the equipment, I mean, keep in mind, again, this is state of the art at the time, not by today's standards. Atmospherics, and on top of that, other receiving stations were picking up perhaps what Amelia Earhart was sending, but not Leo Ballard's. Maybe other receiving stations were picking up what he was sending, but they weren't. And as they get closer to the island, you know, they're running low on fuel. He's still not getting all the transmissions. In fact, she says one of her last transmissions, I believe it was 6:45 in the morning, we're only 100 miles away. And we have to be approaching the island. At one point, the captain of the Itasca is going to fire up his boilers, the oil-fired power plant, to create a smoke, a funnel of smoke. Maybe they can see that. Leave the key open. We might be able to zoom in on that with our system. The last transmission is 8:45, and so we're running low on fuel, and the last word is, wait, as if she was going to send something else. And that's it. That's it. And at one point, Ballard's is under the impression that they're not going west to east, but at one point north to south. Maybe they had turned around trying to find the island. And they disappear. And to this day, there's really, you know, that's the thing with this story. There's no closure here. Gardner Island, which is like 360 miles southwest of Howland, that was supposed to have been an island that perhaps they pancaked down besides in the water. Now, there are expeditions that were sent there. They didn't find a trace of her or Noonan. In fact, when they went there at the time, they didn't think anyone had been there for 40 years. There was an old rust bucket transport there rusting. George Palmer Putnam Jr. thinks they hit the ocean and the plane went down. It's 17,000 feet down. That's what George Palmer Putnam Jr. says. Now, this is where the stories pop up. That they landed in the Marianas. Here we go with the spy story again. And they were captured by the Japanese. Now, according to so-called eyewitnesses on Saipan and Tinian in the Marianas, which is many miles to the north, the plane was cut up, thrown in the ocean, and the two of them were shot for spying. Yet, what's interesting about that story is, a counter to that story, when they put together the sea search, not only was the Itasca involved in searching the ocean around Howland Island, but the Navy committed the battleship Colorado, the aircraft carrier Lexington, which is of note because that's going to be sunk during the Battle of the Coral Sea in World War II, May of 1942. Actually, the Lexington is the second aircraft carrier this country ever built. Interesting how these things come together here. And her escort ships. This will be the most expensive search, maritime search, ever conducted by the United States Navy in American history up to this point. Cost $4 million. $4 million. In addition, the Japanese send 2 ships. And they will spend 6-7 days cruising 150,000 square miles of ocean. They can't find it. They can't find the plane. But again, another story pops up. And this is one this is one for the books. She wound up being one of the ladies who was Tokyo Rose in Japan during World War II. Yeah, that was later refuted. Another story. A book was written in 1970 by a man by the name of Joe Class. I think he spells his last name K-L-A-A-S. He writes a book about a woman who, living in New Jersey, was really Amelia Earhart. Well, I guess she happened to look a little like Amelia Earhart. Slender, had the same build, maybe some facial features. And that book hits the stands. And it's published by McGraw-Hill. That's a big publisher. This lady swore up and down that she was not Amelia Earhart. She had been a banker in New York City. She will sue and she will win her case. She will get $1.5 million out of McGraw-Hill and the book will be yanked. Laurence Safran. If any of you are familiar with naval intelligence or radio intelligence during World War II, Safran will be involved in breaking Japanese codes. He will be asked, 1970 or so, will you do an investigation? He does. And his ultimate analysis is poor planning with regards to radio direction finding equipment and understanding how to work same, poor planning, and even worse, execution. And so even to I'm sure you probably saw those pictures not all that long ago about her perhaps on Saipan or Tinian with her in the distance. I've seen that picture a number of times, and you can even put a magnifying glass up to this face. You can't tell that's her. Not with any degree of accuracy here. And so to this day, there's still that denial of closure here. But there's another side of the coin here too. Usually when someone goes missing along these lines, doesn't it take 7 years before you officially, let's call it officially close the books? Because again, there's no closure. I think there's no body. Keep in mind what's going on here. The clothing line, the luggage line. You get the picture here? Plus George Palmer Putnam foots an expedition or two as well, hunting for his wife. And he pushes the legal system where she will be considered lost by January 1939. That's to settle the legalities involved here with a lot of the goodies here, I guess, if you want to use that term. But there's no closure here. And it's one of those stories that resonates to the present day. In fact, when I'm up at work, fortunately it's my work email box. I don't get it at home. I get bombarded every week with this new development on the Amelia Earhart story. I guess because we're Army Aviation magazine. I'm sure we're not the only ones who are involved in aviation that get this. No, and I always delete. And so, yeah, I mean, again, there's no end to this story. But it does foster what? The legend? And yet, to me, the concrete aspect of this is, I mean, here's a lady who did cross the Atlantic twice, once on her own, with a lot of long-range flying, and again, this attempt. And yet, in World War II, the Army will hire women to fly planes for the men in Europe across the Atlantic, that hop from the United States, Newfoundland, to Greenland, Iceland, to Ireland or England, so they could be used over on the continent during the war. And not all these women will make it either. It's one of those stories that seems to get lost in the shuffle here during World War II. But again, if you want to use the terminology, they kind of owe their success, if you will, to people like Amelia Earhart, Jacqueline Cochran, people like this. Again, women who were considered part of a man's game here. Interesting what you see here. Absolutely fascinating. It's an interesting story, even though there's no closure to it. Yes?
I believe there were women who flew across the country in testing planes too, right?
Uh-huh.
What were they called?
Well, she was involved in that group known as the 99s, which was a group of women pilots.
Right.
And I believe they were some of that. But again, you know, as you're seeing this develop, even with women, keep in mind what you're seeing here too, is some of these female flyers of the 1930s. And Amelia, and I'm sure if she had lived, she would have filled some sort of military function here. Now that leads to speculation. Would she have been one of the leading, perhaps, Army Air Force officers running that shuttle run across the Pacific? We don't know because it doesn't happen. But there will be women coming out of this that will be doing some of that thanks to people like her. So you see that going on at the same time. Of course, they don't know the war's coming at this point. But you have to step back and think that her accomplishments help lead to this. Because these women are not flying single-engine planes crossing the Atlantic. They're flying twin-engine, four-engine planes across the Atlantic. So the men can fly them at the front. Interesting what you see here. Fascinating. Yes?
Mark, this has been 4 amazing lectures on 4 amazing women who were involved in different endeavors, who had different interests. When you take a look at the 4 of them, which characteristic do you feel that they all shared in common that was basically the catalyst for their success?
Oh, I think the one that stands out here is Helen Keller. When she was asked, you know, what is most important to you? And she said curiosity and being an independent or free thinker. That's definitely Eleanor Roosevelt. And that had to be people like Susan B. Anthony and Amelia Earhart. She was a voracious reader in a wide variety of topics. And so does that help define her as an individual? Oh yeah, of course it does. So I think Helen Keller kind of sums it up for all of them. Curiosity, you have to be curious here. There's just no way of not accomplishing what they accomplished without having some sort of curiosity. And being an intelligent thinker. That's part of this. You know, that's part of this. Interesting how she kind of sums this up here, Helen Keller. But you're right, all these women were helping raise the stature of women in this era, but at the same time they're like going in different directions to do this. But they're all gonna meet up at the pass somewhere along the line, whether they know each other or not, or whether they live in quite the same era or not. It's fascinating. You know, and then when you take a look at women in aviation, you take a look at the Soviets. They actually fielded a number of reconnaissance squadrons in World War II on the Eastern Front. Women pilots, rear gunners too. Of course, their situation is different than ours during World War II. You needed a man with a rifle. And so, yeah, despite the fact they'll build a large Air Force, by the way. But some of the other functions could be handled by women. And that meant even going into combat, which women here really won't do. In fact, at one point as the war proceeds on the Eastern Front, at least 50% of all anti-aircraft gunners in the Soviet Union will be women. But it's
they're running out of men.
They needed the men.
Yeah.
They needed the men. But of course, yeah, that's maybe a different topic for discussion. But yeah, that's part. In fact, let me give you one quick thing about that. You know, we're going to lose 405,399 dead in World War II. That's according to the Navy Department. The Soviets will lose 25 million. And out of that, 75% of the 25 million are men. And Oxford did a study on this. Interesting what you find here, that in 1940-41, for every 10 women in the Soviet Union, there were 9.1 men. In 1945-46, for every 10 women, there were 6.5 men. And many of those men who died were in that 20 to 45-year-old age group. So obviously here, these are the guys that build the buildings, rebuild the villages, fix the roads, and regenerate the population. I don't think Russia's ever recovered from that totally. I don't think they have. And so, yeah, it's interesting. But again, women here were very important to the Soviets. Like here, working in the factories, they were doing that in the Soviet Union. Many women were building T-34 tanks and Il-2 Sturmoviks. Yeah, so women were part of the effort. But again, they're flying more in combat than women here. But you really can't, you know, our society's different. Plus, we weren't invaded, so we can afford it. But you can't, but I think a lot of that aspect of these women flying these planes towards the front gets lost in the shuffle. Like the Tuskegee Airmen were lost in the shuffle for a while. Now, you know how this goes. So it's fascinating to see. Yes?
I don't think it's that unusual that planes get lost and sometimes they're not found until years later.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
A couple of years ago, they had that plane in the South China Sea or Malaysia.
Mm-hmm.
Never found.
Right. Well, I have a book on the, I have a whole bunch of books on, but one in particular about the history of the B-24 Liberator, the B-17 Stablemate, another four-engine bomber. That plane went down during the Second World War in the Libyan desert. They didn't find it until 1961. It was sitting in the desert for 16 years.
Who made those planes?
Republic. Or no, pardon me, Consolidated did. The Consolidated Aircraft Company, right. In fact, if you go back to World War II, you will find that the B-24 is the most mass-produced American combat plane in our history. 18,463 copies. And what's interesting, what's fascinating about America, they converted the Willow Run plant, that Ford, an automobile company making bombers, and they'll make over 5,000 of them. You know, when you want to do it, you'll do it in a war. And yeah, and a lot of those, some of those workers were who? Now we're back to the women again. Yeah, yeah, wow.
And Henry Ford was against the war.
Yeah, but you know, but again, the long arm of Amelia Earhart here with women in aviation. In fact, the first female aviator in Army aviation will fly a helicopter goes back to 1974. And so again, you see helicopters now, just after Vietnam here, just after we get out of Vietnam. And so yeah, and so now we have female helicopter pilots in Army aviation. Still, most of them are men, but still, fact of the matter is you have them. You know, you don't need to be a muscle man to fly a plane. So.
Did her sister have any similar vocation?
I didn't get too much involved in her sister after they grew up. I do know that she'll live to be 99 years old. She'll live a long time. But it's Amelia I really stuck to after a while. Well, she's a fascinating person. She's an interesting person. And, you know, if you're getting into the social aspects of this, her marriage to George Palmer Putnam must have been a lot of fun. If you're on the outside of that family. So, and she really liked David Putnam, the younger son. She really liked him. And, but yeah, interesting that Gore Vidal got to know her when he was like 8, 10, 12 years old. The conversations he had with her. Fascinating. Really fascinating. Of course, he was involved in aviation too because his father was. You know, he was born at West Point. He was born in West Point. Yeah, he was born at West Point. And so, in fact, Gore Vidal will learn to fly a plane courtesy of his father when he's 10 years old, and that's on a Pathé newsreel. His father was trying to show that if a 10-year-old kid can fly a plane, anybody can fly a plane. So, yeah. Interesting how these different people come together here. You know, Amelia Earhart, General Jean Vidal, and Eleanor Roosevelt. I mean, the Paul Mance, people like this coming together in one form or another because of what? Aviation at the time. It's fascinating. It's fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. Anybody have any questions? No?
Where do you think Amelia Earhart is?
I would hazard a guess. Although another man who did it back at the turn of the century, who was supposed to be an expert in retrieving ships and planes from situations like this, thinks that by this stage of the game, meaning, he said this, what, about 10, 12 years ago, he said that plane might be dissolved at this point. He says, we're talking a plane, not a ship. A lot more steel on a ship. And so he thinks the plane might be dissolved by this point. So what are you looking for here? You know? Yeah, it is interesting. I mean, how much of these big ships are dissolved in 75 or 100 years? Gee, we found it. But how much of it is left? No. That's just the passage of time and the effects of the environment. So, you know, again, no closure here, but it does bring up the stories. It does bring up the stories here. Oh, yes. Yes, ma'am.
You know, I saw somebody came up 2 months ago with some pictures from some archives that showed that she had landed in the Pacific, the Japanese, and then there was a, did you see that?
Your walk is just.
Yeah.
Is that what you were talking about?
Yeah.
Yeah, and they saw, yeah, it was a picture of a woman and Fred Noonan, and they have matched it up, supposedly.
Right. That's what they say,
She
yeah.
was in prison there, jail there, in horrible circumstances.
Right. And that the Japanese shot both her and Noonan.
Except a scholar.
But I think they proved that that picture was taken at a different time.
2 years before.
Subsequent thing about that
Yeah.
it's not accurate.
No, I mean, you have to view that. That has to be suspect.
And weren't there people who thought they found skeletons on some island?
Now, there was a team that went to Tinian to do the excavating. Found nothing. So you know, again, they don't know. But you were alluding to a point. Yeah.
But the picture that you were referring to, a scholar went through some archives and found a photograph in a book that was printed 2 years earlier than that picture that was shown. So at least one of those was developed.
Yeah, I mean, it's so murky. And you really can't take what you're seeing here as gospel. You know, there's just no, we found the body, we found the plane. Okay, now we can close the books. Well, no, we haven't had that yet. So until we get that, you know. I mean, you've read stories too of these families of lost loved ones in the war, but they don't know where they are. Where'd they go? They don't know. So, interesting how that is. Interesting. Anybody else have any questions or comments? No, then I guess we're done. Have a good afternoon.